The wind cut across the plains like a jagged knife, carrying dust and the faint scent of scorched earth. He sat on the rough-hewn porch of his cabin, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon where the sun bled into a wash of red and gold. Each gust rattled the boards beneath him, each creak a reminder that time had worn both the land and himself down to splinters. His hands, callous and scarred, traced the contours of the rifle laid across his lap. He had cleaned it carefully, almost ritualistically, as though polishing away the memories that clung to its steel. The year was 1867, and the frontier was merciless. Towns rose and fell like the tides, and men like him, hardened, scarred, and alone, were often swallowed by it. He had counted every loss. His wife and child, stolen by fever one bitter winter. His brother, cut down in a gambling dispute that left blood soaking the boards of a tavern in Dodge City. Friends had either vanished or turned their guns on him. Now, only the endless plains remained, stretching the horizon in waves of brown and gold, mocking him with their silence. He had made his preparations. The rifle was loaded, the barrel cleaned. He had marked the spot by the back porch, the only place he'd ever felt close to something resembling peace. A noose of resolve tightened around his chest, a grim acceptance that he would meet the end on his own terms. Life had been cruel, but it would not have the satisfaction of breaking him further. The wind shifted, carrying a sound faint yet distinct. It was human, a stumble, a fall, a soft cry caught in the clamor of the plains. He frowned, squinting into the settling dust. This land gave little mercy to anyone who wandered unprepared. Most would not last a day. Yet the sound persisted, fragile and pleading, riding on the wind like a wisp of smoke. For the first time in weeks, he felt the stirrings of something he had long believed dead. Curiosity, hesitation, perhaps even a sliver of hope. Or maybe it was irritation at the interruption. Either way, he rose, rifle slung across his back, and moved toward the sound, boots crunching over gravel and parched earth. The figure appeared like a specter through the swirling dust. A woman, pregnant, frail, staggering, collapsed near the gate, her fingers clawing at the dry soil. Her clothes were torn, streaked with mud, and her dark hair plastered to a face pale with exhaustion. She lifted her eyes just long enough for him to see the fear and desperation mirrored in their depths. He stopped a few feet away, breathing hard, uncertain. She was a stranger. She was trouble, and yet she was alive, and alive in a way that made his own death feel suddenly premature. He lowered his rifle, though he did not entirely sheath a suspicion. "You all right there?" he called, voice rough like gravel, carrying away a man who had spoken too little and endured too much. The woman coughed, a soft, choking sound before shaking her head. Her hands trembled as she reached for the gatepost, and her knees buckled beneath her. The wind tugged at her skirts, whipping them into a frenzy. He moved swiftly, catching her just before she hit the ground, pulling her against his chest. She gasped, startled, weak arms wrapping briefly around him before falling limp again. "Who sent you?" he demanded, urgency mixing with suspicion. "Ain't nobody walks these plains for pleasure." She shook her head, lips parting with a fragile whisper. "No, no one. I just—" Her voice broke, and she collapsed further, exhausted and trembling. He cursed under his breath, glancing toward the horizon, as if hoping an answer might ride the wind back to him. But there was none. Only dust, only silence, only the weight of responsibility settling unbidden across his shoulders. He lifted her into the cabin, laying her on the rough blanket that had long been his only comfort. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse faint but steady. He tore a strip from his own shirt to bind a small wound along her arm. The sight of the blood, the vulnerability, the fragility of life in her trembling frame, it shook him more than he expected. "You shouldn't have come here," he muttered, not entirely to her but to himself. His heart thrummed in a way it hadn't in years, the kind of rhythm that reminded him life could still be taken, and maybe, for the first time, that it could still be worth saving. She lifted her eyes again, darker than twilight, searching his face for something she couldn't name. Fear? Desperation? Perhaps, instinctively, she knew he was as broken as she was. He met her gaze, recognizing the reflection of a world equally cruel, equally unyielding. And in that moment, the wind outside felt less like an enemy and more like a herald, carrying them both into a path they hadn't chosen, but could no longer deny. The fire he built crackled, throwing shadows across the cabin walls, illuminating the sharp angles of his face and the hollow weariness behind his eyes. Her gaze followed every movement, a delicate dance of curiosity, caution, and trust forming in the silent spaces between words. They were strangers, yes, but the plains, harsh and indifferent, had conspired to place them together. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony. He knelt beside her, tending to the wound with hands steadier than his heart. Each motion, each brush of cloth across skin, each careful patting of the blooded bandage, reminded him of a time long gone, a life that had once been warm, connected, and full. Memories surged unbidden. Her face, imagined, laughter from a hearth long extinguished, the smell of coffee and bread before dawn. Pain, loss, regret. She murmured something low, indecipherable at first, then a fragile whisper, "Thank you." The words were small, but they struck him with the force of a rifle blast. Gratitude, pure, unadorned, and raw, broke something within him. His own plan for the day, the one he had rehearsed with grim precision, seemed suddenly absurd. How could he consider leaving this life, this woman, alone on a plane that would consume her without hesitation? Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault, rattling the cabin and carrying the whisper of distant coyotes. He looked at the horizon, the sun now a dying ember, and felt the stirrings of a choice he hadn't dared make in years. Protection, responsibility, perhaps even redemption. The stranger at his gate, collapsed and trembling, had thrown a lifeline into the darkness he had built around himself. "I'll keep you safe," he said, voice low but firm, a promise to a woman who might not even remember him tomorrow. "As long as I draw breath." Her eyelids fluttered, and for a fleeting moment, a faint smile ghosted across her face, a fragile beacon in a world that had been cruel to both of them. He returned the smile, hesitant, unfamiliar, yet entirely necessary. The man who had been ready to die felt the first spark of life stir within him, ignited not by hope, but by a sense of duty and the undeniable pull of something far stronger than fear. Human connection. The night descended quickly, bringing with it cold and quiet, broken only by the creaking of the cabin and the whispering wind. They settled near the fire, both weary, both exhausted, both irrevocably bound by circumstance. Outside, the plains remained indifferent, untamed, and unforgiving. Inside, for the first time in years, a fragile warmth took root, and in that warmth the story began. The morning came harsh and sharp, the sunlight slicing through the cabin's small windows in narrow golden beams. Outside, the plains stretched endlessly, dry and unforgiving, shimmering with the heat of the early day. Inside, the cabin was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the dying embers in the hearth and the faint, uneven breaths of the woman lying on the rough blanket. She stirred, a soft groan escaping her lips, and he watched her cautiously. Every movement was measured, every glance a silent test of trust. He had made her breakfast, a small portion of bread and coffee, the aroma filling the cramped space with a fleeting sense of normalcy. She took it slowly, eyes darting around the cabin, the muscles in her arms tensing as though expecting sudden violence. He noticed the fear etched into the lines of her face, the way she flinched at shadows. And though his own life had been steeped in suspicion and solitude, he found himself offering a gentleness that surprised him, a patience that he had thought dead. "You'll need to rest today," he said, his voice low but firm. "No moving out there until you've eaten properly." He gestured toward the cabin's small porch, where the wind carried dust in lazy spirals across the wooden planks. She nodded, hesitating before allowing him to help her sit upright. Her hands trembled, and he caught them as they hovered over her stomach, a protective instinct blooming without warning. The woman's name remained a mystery. She offered none when pressed, only a quiet shake of the head and a glance that begged him not to ask further. He respected it, understanding that silence sometimes carried more truth than words. And in that unspoken acknowledgement, a fragile trust began to grow, a tenuous tether binding them together against a world that had shown neither mercy nor compassion. They spent the morning tending to the cabin, gathering water from the small cistern outside, and securing the loose boards that threatened to blow open in the wind. Each task was mundane, yet the act of working side by side, sharing the labor, allowed small pieces of humanity to resurface. He began to notice her subtle smiles, the way her eyes brightened at the smallest comfort, and a spark of purpose took root in him. Protection was no longer a chore, it was a choice. By midday, the plains beyond the cabin seemed deceptively calm. Yet he knew better. The wilderness offered no quarter. A distant sound carried over the wind, faint but unmistakable. The gallop of horses, hooves drumming across the parched earth. He froze, listening intently. The woman noticed a change in his posture and leaned closer, instinctively seeking protection. "Stay behind me," he whispered, his hand tightening on the rifle slung across his back. The sound grew louder, accompanied by faint voices, rough and laughing. A band of men approaching with intent that reeked of trouble. He stepped onto the porch, eyes narrowing as the figures emerged from the dust. For riders, bandits by the look of their worn leather jackets and the cold glint in their eyes. Guns hung loosely at their sides, fingers twitching near triggers, mouths curled in cruel amusement. The wind whipped around them, carrying dust and the metallic scent of fear. The first shot came without warning, a warning or a test. He couldn't tell. Instinct took over. He dropped behind the porch railing, returning fire with careful precision. The crack of the rifle echoing across the plains. The woman crouched behind him, hands pressed over her stomach, eyes wide with terror. He barked orders, voice rough and commanding. "Stay low. Don't move." The exchange was brief but brutal. Dust kicked up around them, smoke and the tang of gunpowder filling the air. He moved swiftly, taking cover behind the cabin's corner, peering around to locate each threat. One bandit fell, another ducked behind a wagon wheel. His shouts cut short by a well-aimed shot. The fight was over almost as suddenly as it began, leaving bodies sprawled on the dirt and an uneasy silence that hummed in their ears. The woman trembled as he approached, inspecting her for injuries. None. She had survived, but her wide eyes reflected the raw terror of the encounter. He realized then that the danger was no longer theoretical. It was real, and it would not relent. This was only the beginning, and survival would demand vigilance, cunning, and trust. The night that followed was restless. The wind howled across the plains, rattling the cabin walls, and shadows leapt across their faces as the fire sputtered in the hearth. Neither spoke much at first. Words seemed unnecessary when every glance, every movement carried weight. He cleaned the rifle again, checking the cartridges and oiling the mechanisms with methodical care. She watched, fascinated, her curiosity tempered by exhaustion and lingering fear. Why help me?" she asked finally, voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the smoky air, delicate yet pointed. He hesitated, unsure whether to answer. His life had been a litany of loss and selfish choices. Yet here she was, trusting him, needing him, offering a spark of something he hadn't known he still craved. "Because," he said slowly, "I don't aim to die today. Not when there's someone worth keeping alive." The words sounded strange even to his own ears, heavy with sincerity he hadn't felt in years. Days passed in a blur of tension and vigilance. They ventured out cautiously, foraging for food and water, navigating treacherous terrain, and keeping one eye on the horizon for signs of trouble. Each challenge deepened their bond. A river crossing where swift currents threatened to sweep them away, a rattlesnake startled in the grass, forcing her to act with quick reflexes to protect her. Every moment of survival was punctuated by shared fear, whispered reassurances, and subtle gestures of care. She began to reveal pieces of her story. A journey southward, an urgent need to escape unnamed pursuers, a life lived on the edge of desperation. He listened, revealing little of his own past, though the walls around him softened with every tale she told, every glance of gratitude, every shared heartbeat in moments of peril. One evening, as the sun sank behind the distant hills, casting the plains in molten gold, they sat by the fire, exhausted but alive. He handed her a cup of water, and she met his gaze, no words necessary. The shared glance spoke of reliance, trust, and an unspoken understanding. Survival was no longer a solitary pursuit. It had become a shared responsibility, a partnership forged in adversity. Yet beyond the glow of the fire, the night remained indifferent, shadows shifting with intent that neither of them could predict. The plains did not forgive. The bandits might not have been finished, and other dangers lay in wait. But for now, they had each other, and that, in a world of dust, wind, and relentless struggle, was enough to keep them moving forward. The woman leaned slightly against him, exhaustion softening her rigid posture. He felt it then, the faintest stirring of hope, fragile yet undeniable. Life, which he had been ready to abandon, had begun to assert itself through her presence, through their shared trials, through the unspoken bond that had taken root. He realized that the plains had not only brought them together, they had given him a reason to continue, a reason to fight, and a reason to live. The first light of dawn bled across the horizon, pale and unforgiving, painting the plains in shades of gold and steel. The cabin, usually a haven, felt exposed under the morning sun. He stood on the porch, rifle in hand, eyes narrowing against the glare. The wind whispered of trouble, carrying faint hoofbeats and the low murmur of voices from the distant ridge. "They're coming!" he muttered, more to himself than to her. She stood behind him, clutching the rough blanket to her chest, every muscle taut with fear and anticipation. Her dark hair framed a face lined with exhaustion, but lit by determination. In the quiet, they shared a look that needed no words. Survival would demand every ounce of courage they had left. The bandits appeared like shadows emerging from the dust, their horses' hooves drumming a relentless rhythm across the dry earth. For men, each armed and reckless, eyes glinting with malice and greed. One of them raised a hand, a signal, and the other spread wide, surrounding the cabin with methodical precision. He ducked behind the porch railing, motioning her down. "Stay low. Don't breathe louder than the wind." Her hand found his arm briefly, a silent plea, a tether to the one person she trusted in a world that had shown her nothing but peril. The first shot cracked through the morning air, a sharp punctuation that sent splinters from the railing and dust from the dry soil. He fired in response, every pull of the trigger deliberate, every movement precise. Smoke and grit filled the air. The sound of galloping horses, shouting, and gunfire blended into a chaotic symphony of danger. One of the bandits fell, slumping over the saddle as a bullet found its mark. Another dug behind a boulder, cursing, firing wildly. He moved quickly, stepping across the porch and taking cover behind a large oak barrel. She crouched beside the cabin wall, fingers pressed over her stomach, eyes wide but unwavering. "Now!" he barked, and she followed instinctively, moving behind him as he advanced, keeping low, keeping steady. The wind carried dust into his eyes, grit into his mouth, but he pressed on, driven by something far stronger than fear, something he had almost forgotten, the need to protect, to fight, to live. The bandits pressed, relentless and calculating, but he anticipated their movements. Each step and gesture a puzzle he solved with cold efficiency. A rider charged, gun raised. He fired, the crack of the rifle echoing across the plains. The horse shied, throwing its rider into the dirt. Another tried a flanking maneuver, and he pivoted, taking aim mid-step. Each shot was a statement, a reclaiming of a life he had once deemed unworthy. Amid the chaos, the woman slipped from cover, moving toward the back of the cabin to retrieve water and supplies. A bandit spotted her, raising his weapon, and instinctively he lunged, pushing her down as a bullet tore through the air where her head had been moments before. Dust and smoke mingled, a cloud of raw danger and urgency. The fight pressed on, tense and brutal, every heartbeat stretched in by adrenaline. He felt the weight of years, of loss, of despair, crashing into the present. Every shot fired was more than survival. It was reclamation, defiance, a promise kept. And when the last bandit fell, sprawled across the dirt, silence crashed over the plains like a sudden storm. Breath came in ragged gasps, sweat stinging eyes and hair plastered to his forehead. The woman rose, trembling, eyes scanning for further threats. There were none. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, the danger receded, leaving only the raw, unfiltered reality of what they had endured and what they had survived together. He lowered the rifle, the weight of it heavy in his hands, but lighter than the burden that had been lifted from his heart. She approached cautiously, voice soft but steady. We made it." He nodded, feeling the truth of it in his bones. They had survived, yes, but more than that, they had endured as a pair, bound not by chance but by necessity, courage, and something deeper still, trust. The plains fell silent after the last echoes of gunfire. The wind returned, gentler now, whispering through the grasses, as if acknowledging the struggle that had just passed. He helped her back inside the cabin, setting water and cloth beside her, though neither spoke much. Words were unnecessary. The understanding between them ran deeper than any conversation could. She sat, finally allowed herself to rest, eyes closing as exhaustion claimed her. He watched her, the curve of her belly a testament to life and hope, fragile yet persistent. He felt something shift inside him, a gnawing emptiness replaced with a raw, undeniable stirrings of purpose. For the first time in years, he felt tethered to life, not by duty alone, but by the bond they shared, forged in fire, sweat, and survival. Night fell like a velvet blanket over the plains, stars prickling the sky, indifferent witnesses to the trials below. He tended the fire, its glow casting long, flickering shadows across the cabin walls. She stirred slightly, turning to glance at him, eyes wide and vulnerable. He offered a rare smile, one that carried warmth and relief. "You're safe now," he murmured, "at least for tonight." In the silence that followed, he allowed himself a rare reflection, thoughts drifting across years of loss, grief, and the weight of solitude. This woman, stranger, burden, salvation, had become his reason to continue, his anchor in a world that had offered him nothing but hardship. And he realized with startling clarity that the life he had once considered ending now held promise. The promise of protection, love, and a future worth living for. The fire dwindled to embers, and she leaned against him gently, exhaustion giving way to trust. Outside, the wind caressed the plain softly, carrying with it the faintest scent of sage and distant rain. He thought of the horizon, endless and unyielding, yet now less terrifying than it had been. They would face the challenges ahead together, stronger for having endured the trials that had tested their courage, their resolve, and their hearts. Dawn would come again, bringing with it new challenges, new threats, and new trials. But it would also bring life, resilience, and the unspoken promise that they could endure anything, as long as they faced it side by side. He closed his eyes, letting the quiet seep in, allowing the first real rest he had known in years. The world beyond the cabin was still vast, harsh, and unpredictable, but inside, he had found something worth fighting for. And in that realization, he knew he would never be ready to die again, not while life, fragile and stubborn, pressed against his chest in the form of a stranger who had become everything.